Hello everyone. Today I'm going to show you a research proposal for the factors influencing volunteer retention in tackle football. My name is Mason S.J. Kroll, and let's get right into the content. Our introduction. Volunteers are a crucial proponent of a community's social cohesiveness in Canada and the running of majority of small sport and recreation businesses. One half of Canadians volunteer for non-profit organizations which could not be sustainable without the aid of these volunteers. The purpose of this research is to identify any potential problematic factors with retaining volunteers in football organizations in Fredericton. The rationale or reason for doing this research is half of organizations had serious problems retaining volunteers in Canada, and the other reason is football has a wide range of coaches and volunteers. Because the player positions in tackle football are very specialized and diverse, you're going to need a very diverse group of coaches who have different skill sets. So depending on community football, what level, it can vary from 1 to 8 coaches. And ideally they're going to want as many coaches as possible, which is around 8 or possibly a bit more. All of this leads me to the research question, which is, what are the factors that influence volunteer retention in football organizations throughout Fredericton? Next is our aims and objectives. Our aim number 1 is basically a further question for answering our research question. And what we're going to do for our aim number 1 is explore why people stay volunteering rather than discontinuing volunteering. Objective A for answering our aim number 1 is to conduct a literature search. And objective B is to determine the difference in the literature and Fredericton football organizations for why volunteers stay volunteering. Aim number 2, we're going to explore why people volunteer in football in Fredericton. Our objective A for figuring out our aim number 2 is to conduct a literature search. Objective B, we're going to resort to conducting interviews to see why people volunteer in Fredericton. Objective C, we're going to analyze the data to see a general picture of Fredericton volunteers. What I mean by analyze, we're going to analyze the literature search that we did and the data that we actually collected from actual volunteers in Fredericton football organizations. Our aim number 3, we're going to explore people's barriers to continuing volunteering throughout their life. And objective A, we're going to conduct a literature search. And objective B, we're going to determine if there is a difference in the literature for barriers to volunteering in Fredericton. The methods that will be used for collecting data from football organizations are qualitative, non-probability, convenience sampling research methods. The population is going to be a mixture of coaches, administrative volunteers, based on ease of access. The way the information will be obtained is through interviews with semi-structured questions. The timescale of this research project will take approximately 8 months because the current football season is just reaching its conclusion, and we want to submit a proposal and contact organizations by June and July, and by August we want to start the interview process. In October, we want to analyze our interview data so we can submit our research by November and December. The purpose of this literature review is to gain knowledge of the previous data that has been documented on why people stay volunteering, why people volunteer in Fredericton, and explore the barriers to volunteering. The literature will be used to expose consistent themes and gaps in previous research in relation to this paper's question of what are the factors that influence volunteer retention in football organizations throughout Fredericton. Professionalization and performance trends are seen in sports. This is not exclusive to sports, as cancer charities have the same performance trends. Hospice care has troubles with volunteer retention as well. As we see, volunteer retention is not exclusive to sport organizations. Voluntary sport organizations are professionalizing with standards that are seen in the private sector. These rigid performance outcomes and measures imposed on voluntary sport organizations are further alienating volunteers. Lack of training in volunteers is shown to lead to dropout. 90% of volunteers in a municipal soccer organization coach their own children or relatives. Volunteers coach to help children boost their own skills and gain employability. 40% of turnover rate was seen on volunteers in Australian VSOs, and they were also seen to want to help children. Informal family support better serves volunteers than formal family support does. People are less likely to leave under informal conditions. This was performed on for-profit organizations, so it is only speculative when applying this logic to non-profit volunteer organizations, or VSOs. This research used a sociological model on the 2010 Nordic Ski Championships and found that volunteers were more reflexive and self-centered in their volunteer motives. These reflexive traits were mostly seen in younger women. A Swiss study in sport organizations showed that collective solidarity was seen to lead to long-term commitment. Divergence of interest in organizations was seen to lower commitment, and increased commitment to the organization was seen when volunteers' children were involved. United Kingdom voluntary sport organizations reported having pressure from government to professionalize. To mention one, swimming organizations had troubles with accreditation schemes. A study with human resource management perspective found that more implementation of HRM practices in VSOs lowered the perception of voluntary retention problems. An Ontario study on volunteer executive sport committees showed that increased group cohesion led to increased individual commitment. Task cohesion was most attractive work quality, and larger groups have higher social cohesiveness but have less communication. The organizational structure of some VSOs is created from the long historical efforts of a few individuals. An example of this is the Fredericton Red Bombers Football Club. U.S. Bureau of Statistics show that people from smaller cities reported having less time to volunteer in contrast to people from bigger cities. Does Fredericton citizens generally have enough time to volunteer given it is a small city? In the U.S., some contemporary trends is that some volunteer organizations are looking for episodic volunteers. People want to volunteer so they can contribute to impactful services and increase their social status. In a U.S. national survey, it showed that the youth volunteer more than any other demographic and do so episodically, yet the older generation are more committed to long-term volunteering and comprise most of the hours worked. In Canada, pretty much the same picture is shown like the U.S., that young volunteers do most of the volunteering, yet the older generation comprise the majority of volunteer hours. This correlates to the Fredericton Red Bombers because the older generation are most dedicated, yet the students at UNB and community youth volunteer episodically. People in Nashville refer to volunteering as a sexy quality. People volunteer to make an impact, for social status gains, and to learn new skills. Volunteer retention is a problem that is worldwide. Australian sport organizations reported that volunteers left because of lack of enjoyment, lack of team success, and lack of stakeholder support. Australian sport organizations are on the rise, yet are growing, but have plateaued because of lack of volunteers. 3 out of 21 people from the Aspley Football Club in Brisbane were still coaching from 2001 to 2005. UK sport volunteers are dropping out and have reported their reasons for burnout, concerns of self-efficacy, lack of time, lack of enjoyment, lack of challenge, lack of work-life balance, administrative problems, and no professional development. Most of the dropouts' reasons were personal and could not have been influenced by the organization. There is a conflicting theme where people want to volunteer as a goodwill gesture, yet volunteer motives are also very self-centered. As Australian participants go up, volunteers tend to drop out. In this Australian study on rugby clubs, it was recorded that there are no correlation between people's motives of volunteering and their decision to discontinue volunteering. The message derived is that it is difficult to predict a volunteer's decision to stay or leave, but positive experience are the greatest predictor currently known. Since this is a research proposal on factors influencing volunteer retention, this page here is a summary of the literature review that I have put together, and right here it identifies all the themes that I have found throughout the literature review. If you want to get a more in-depth read on this, I would recommend to pause this video right now. I would also like to mention that the themes that you see in this summary are going to be what we are searching for when research is done on Fredericton football organizations, because these are what will be expected from analyzing past studies on volunteer retention. Gaps in current research. Every factor that consequently deters people from continuing to volunteer is unknown in football organizations in Fredericton. In fact, there is little research at all in tackle football within Canada other than concussion and injury research. The findings are going to add information to the database of volunteerism in Canadian football and help develop an idea of what influences people's volunteer decisions in football. The research will add diversity to the research on volunteerism and identify issues for organizations to better retain volunteers. This literature review provides themes that help predict what factors may influence volunteer retention in Fredericton football organizations. Theoretical framework. Based on the questions and goals that needs to be answered for this research, a theoretical framework of Alderfer's ERG is going to be applied. This theory is similar to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Alderfer's theory is more simplistic as it lowers the variables to 3, which are weighed or calculated to estimate one's motivation of performing a task. By understanding one's motivation levels, it can help depict whether people will drop out of volunteering or not. If someone's initial needs are not met upon volunteering, theoretically they will discontinue volunteering. Precisely what we are measuring is an individual's motivation to make the decision of volunteering for retention purposes. People's reasons for volunteering, barriers, and frustrations are the type of factors that will influence volunteers' retention within Fredericton football organizations. The following formula is what encompasses Alderfer's theory. Existence times relatedness times growth equals motivation to do a task. ERG theory can better be explained through an abstract model of a hierarchical pyramid. I'm going to talk about the 3 variables of ERG. Existence is our physiological needs like sleeping and eating, and our security and safety, which is seen in occupation. And relatedness is our social needs, our love, and our internal self-esteem. Growth is our external self-esteem and our self-actualization. The goals in an idealist life is to reach the growth phase of self-actualization, but in order to do that, one must fulfill their existential needs and relatedness needs. When one fulfills their foundational needs of existence, they can move along to relatedness needs. When one fulfills their relatedness needs, they can move along to more personal growth needs. This is called satisfaction progression, and it's, in abstract terms, is climbing the pyramid towards self-actualization. When one fails at fulfilling their needs, or one of their foundational needs arise again, then the lower needs on the pyramid take priority over those higher on the pyramid. Falling down the pyramid is called frustration regression. Volunteer work would be classified in relatedness and growth needs, which means that it is not a foundational need of a person's needs. Therefore, theoretically, volunteering will take less priority in one's life. In closing, I would like to further rationalize the importance of this research proposal. 49% of organizations in Canada had problems retaining volunteers. Volunteer retention is a worldwide problem, not just in Canada. Football requires a lot of volunteers to run a team. Volunteer retention is an extraordinary problem in that there are plenty of variables that affect that affects volunteer retention. There is not one solution to the problem, so it constantly has to be monitored as a problem. Volunteers have specialized needs, and in many cases they're not being met. Few volunteer literature or research in football organizations have been done in Canada. The football system in New Brunswick has problems. Only 28 football players in CIS were from New Brunswick in 2013. This included the province of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Ontario. And through my experiences playing football in Moncton, through all the coaches that I have had, there was new familiar faces coming in and out and leaving throughout many years of playing football. So that's just a lead that potentially there is a problem in Fredericton as well. Also, a growing importance of football in New Brunswick as our CIS team has had recent success. The AFL is relatively new. New Brunswick has 2 AFL teams. The AFL has sent players to the CFL Combine. 2 players from the AFL have recently become CIS All-Stars. The Touchdown Atlantic has brought a lot of attention to New Brunswick football. New Brunswick has brought back 2 provincial football teams. In Canada, over half of all nonprofit sport and recreation organizations had struggled with retention and recruitment of volunteers. With that said, Canada actually has a high population of volunteers and it is still not enough. That is the finish of my research proposal for the factors influencing volunteer retention in tackle football. I hope you have a good evening, and cheers.